What is the condition of free speech in America today? I'm Sanford Unger, Director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University, and on this series, Speaking Freely, we talk from time to time with thought leaders and major players in the free speech drama unfolding in America. Today, Cindy Cohn, the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Cindy Cohn, the internet is the new sort of battleground for the First Amendment, many people say. Mm-hmm. And how is that true?
Well, I mean, the thing that is awesome about the digital technologies is they let everyone communicate with each other theoretically on equal footing, right? Traditionally, you know, you would say that, you know, free speech is your right to buy a printing press, right?
Right.
And so the number of people who could actually participate in the public discussion was really limited because of the expense.
Freedom of the press belongs to those who own one.
Right, exactly. Well, now we all own one.
Right.
Right. But maybe not all, but the barriers to entry have been really, really lowered, which means everybody can have a voice. And you know, as late as the late 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Aclu versus Reno, recognized that this was an opportunity to fulfill the promise of free speech in the First Amendment, that not just rich people and not just people who are in the business could have a voice, but that everybody could have a voice. So this was one of the first projects of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU, was to make sure that as these technologies developed, the benefit that they gave all of us, that we could all have a voice in our ongoing public debates, was enshrined and protected by the Constitution, and we were able to win that, you know, pretty early on. So,
when did you win that?
Well, ACLU versus Reno, I believe, was 1996 or 7. Gosh, I need to remember, but the late 1990s,
20 years ago.
A long time ago. And it's a ringing endorsement. It was a 9-0 decision that recognized that the internet was a place of free speech, and especially a new kind of place of free speech, in that it really was free speech for everyone, not just for the wealthy.
So now, is there a dangerous aspect to that some people, of course, say things, write things, circulate things on the internet that are not only untrue, but malicious, can do harm to people?
Sure, we've never really protected free speech because we're going to like everything that
no, of course not. I
say,
understand that.
Or that there aren't ideas that are dangerous and scary.
Right.
Those things are always true. And then when you democratize that power, you're going to get people whose voices may not have been heard, who are saying really ugly and awful things, that are going to have a bit of a megaphone. It puts responsibility back on us, the listeners, to really be able to differentiate between truth and falsity, between good ideas and bad ideas. I mean, this is the promise of self-government.
Well, that's the promise of democracy.
Correct.
And certainly the founders thought that would work.
Well, they didn't want there to be a gatekeeper who got to decide what the rest of us heard. And that's not because there won't be bad ideas. It's because who are you going to give that power to? The power of the gatekeeper is so strong,
of course,
that it ends up being the most important person. And then you've taken this thing that you democratized and made it not a democracy anymore. But that does create responsibilities for the rest of us.
You said a moment ago that we depend on the good sense and the ability of people to distinguish good from bad, and I'm paraphrasing what you said a moment ago. Are you confident? Do you remain confident in the good sense of consumers of the internet?
Well, I hope so. I do find that every time a new technology gets introduced to people, the kind of first generation of people who get their hands on it, like, have to figure out how to deal with it. This was true about cars. You know, we had horrible traffic accidents in the early days of cars because people didn't know how to drive. I feel like a little bit that we're in the early days of social media where people are going to have to figure out how to drive this thing and not hurt each other.
You set me off thinking about the light bulb, the telephone, the telegraph, all these things.
Yeah, and most of them also, you know, of course, led with porn as the first thing, which is also a similarity with the new technologies. But I think that we are going to have to go through a period where bad things are going to, you know, where we're going to have to figure out how to have the right instincts around some of this information so that we do the right thing. And I still think that the alternative, where you put somebody else in charge of what the rest of us get to see and think about, is worse. And I've watched internet platforms, you know, and their attempts to try to censor and make sure that, you know, that good things happen and bad things don't, and they're horrible at it. I wouldn't trust the government, not the current federal government, but probably not the past one either, to be making those decisions. So you, as much as you might be frustrated with what's going on right now, I don't think you can have that conversation honestly without looking at what the alternatives look like. And so, of course, there are going to be some bad things that happen, and I certainly am not saying that there isn't a downside to this path. What I'm saying is that the other paths also have serious downsides, and there's some magical thinking I find going on right now that, you know, suddenly Mark Zuckerberg's going to become the guy who magically knows the difference between good speech and bad speech. And I can tell you, as much as, you know, no matter what you think about that guy or the team he has, he doesn't. They're not going to make the right decisions. And
well, no one can be vested with that power to make the right decisions about all these things. At the same time, there are some very severe social problems, guns. I think you and I would probably agree there are real issues with guns, and there's a lot of stuff online that stokes the paranoia that contributes to the irresponsible use of guns. And
well, I think that that's true. On the other hand, I think that, to me, if the guns are your problem, then maybe you ought to focus what you're doing about them on the guns and not the speech about guns, because what we're seeing, you know, right now today is the power of the network to organize against guns. But I think that the work that the kids have done in Florida right now around responding to what happened to them could not have happened without social media. So
that is true.
So it's always gonna.
But the opponents of gun control always say the problem is not the guns, the problem is the people who use them, who buy them. You have to regulate the people. You have to, if they're to accept any regulation at all. So isn't what you're saying a little bit? No, you're saying just deal with the guns. You're disagreeing with them.
Well, I think that there are things, I mean, I'm not a gun control expert, I'm an internet expert.
Of course, I understand
but I
that.
do think that there are things that I would rather see the focus on who's getting access to guns and what are they doing on them than who's talking about guns. Because first of all, that's a degree of separation from what actually happens. And I think sometimes it's easier for people to talk about the speech about the thing they don't like than the thing that they don't like. And I see this in the hate speech conversations. You're raising it in the context of the guns, but I think you're one step removed from the problem, and I understand why sometimes that's an easier place to think about than the actual thing, but I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we're focusing on the speech about the thing as opposed to the thing itself. And I think that's true about guns. I think that's true about, you know, the kinds of you know, Nazi protests that are going on. I think that's true about a lot of social problems, that it's kind of convenient and a little fashionable right now to talk about the social networks and their role in this.
What about the problem of false accusations online that are impossible to erase, that things get said that may not be true and they just show up in those Google searches for time immemorial?
Well, I think there's a lot that can be done to require transparency and accountability by the platforms about how how those systems work. It's important to remember that whether you're Google or you're Facebook, you've made a series of design decisions about what shows up first, what shows up more prominently, what shows up more often in these things that are aimed at a particular goal. The goal is to keep you on the platform.
Of course.
And the platform and the neurological science is now pretty clear that what keeps you on the platform is being outraged. And I think that a lot more focus on how these platforms are making the decisions about what they show us. It's not neutral. And getting transparency into that and pressure on them to do things like open up their systems so that somebody else can offer you a different way to interact with that information. Opening up APIs is what we call those, ways to move your data. There's a lot of work that we can do around making sure that we're not captured by the platform strategy of keeping you there that isn't really fundamentally about censorship. It's about transparency and it's about giving us options.
Right.
And I think that those are really fruitful places to look at, because there's a reason why these fake accusations blow up as opposed to being just a thing that happens and then goes away. And that's because of the way that a lot of these systems for deciding what's gonna come up on our feeds work, and we deserve to understand those and to be able to push back on them.
How about the right to be forgotten that's talked about in Europe, where you can get something, I suppose, with the proper evidence or the proper argument, you get something removed?
I'm worried about that, and the reason I'm worried about that is exactly what you said, with the proper evidence and the proper argument. The systems that have been put up right now in the right to be forgotten in Europe, I don't think are sensitive enough to the needs of due process here. And I've been on panels with the privacy commissioners who are implementing this. These are people who are interested in privacy and not necessarily in free speech. Now, I care about both.
You're interested in privacy. We're going to get to that in a second.
I can talk about that, but I really worry. The right to be forgotten, if you look at the history so far, first of all, it has a similar problem that we've seen in other things, which is wealthy people with resources can get information about themselves erased and poor people can't.
But does that mean that no one should be able to do it?
Well, I think that I am very nervous about the right to be forgotten. We've got about a year or two of examples on it. The lack of transparency into how this works. Eugene Volokh, who's a professor at UCLA, discovered that there was a police officer in Texas who had used the right to be forgotten process to try to get some information about something he'd actually done wrong, erased from the internet, and he couldn't even get access to the records of what the request was, because the guy's privacy interest was held to be more important than figuring out what it was he was erasing from the internet. There's a real worry that this kind of rule is going to create a memory hole where it's impossible to find out what actually happened. And again, it's not just going to be that everybody gets to erase their history. It's going to be that prominent people and people who have resources get to erase their history, and the rest of us are going to be stuck with the permanent record that is being created by us, about us, by all of the things that we do online and offline that are being collated. So I worry very much not only about important, useful information going away and the disproportionate way that this has so far been implemented.
Right. Let's segue for a moment to the issue of privacy that we were just talking about. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, as I understand it, is in the vanguard of trying to protect the privacy rights of Americans.
Yes.
And especially perhaps from government surveillance, things like the National Security Agency.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's very difficult to have a self-governing entity when the government knows every communication you have, who you talk to when you talk to them. I think it's fundamental to a functioning self-government system of any kind that people have some privacy from their own government. And if we don't have that, then the rest of it begins to fall. I worry about privacy vis-a-vis big companies too. We don't have the constitutional kinds of tools to go against that.
To protect ourselves against people who sell us cars or...
Yeah, I mean, the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment, they're all about how the government works. So in the context of our litigation, that's really the focus. But we worry as well about the dossiers, and we worry about them because the line between the government and these companies has gone away. The fundamental thing that the NSA is doing now is going to the companies that have all our communications and making them turn that stuff over to them. That's Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, which is a big fight we just lost in Congress, is all about the ability of the government to go to private companies and make them turn over what they know about us and what standards should apply to that. So on the one hand, the focus of our litigation is on the government mainly, but we're not unaware of the very tight relationship between these things.
I think the legislative fight you were just referring to resulted in a bipartisan vote to renew the surveillance programs of the NSA, in effect to make them perhaps more openly legal than they were before.
A little bit. They changed the scope a little bit, but mainly they reauthorized what the government was already doing.
And it appears to be completely bipartisan. I mean,
yeah, the intelligence community is very powerful in both parties. We ended up with Ron Wyden and Senator Cruz and a few other people on. We have a bipartisan opposition and a bipartisan
but not
proponent.
Big enough to prevent it from being renewed.
No, sadly, the intelligence community's muscle on Capitol Hill is very, very strong, and despite lots of concerns about this current administration's ability to abuse their powers and concerns by the current administration about the intelligence community, they were able to ram this thing through. Now they did it by Senator McConnell and Representative Ryan pulling some pretty significant procedural tricks up on Capitol Hill to make sure there wasn't any public debate. There were no public hearings that were significant.
Right.
Ability for people to have their voices heard was truncated both by lack of transparency and the refusal of the government to even say how many Americans are affected by these programs.
So we don't know.
We have no idea. They refused to say. They
Of course,
refused to say. They promised to say, and then reneged on the promise to
there was
say.
a time when we admired congressional leaders for their ability to get things we approved of through without dilatory tactics on the part of the opposition.
Yeah, I think that we're not in those times anymore, and I also think that the inability of Congress to reflect the will of the people is a problem that affects issues far beyond national security. I think it's especially acute in the national security context because the government has been so unwilling to even tell the American people what it's doing, much less let them have a full public debate about it.
And that goes across administrations. That's not a particular failing of one administration or another.
No, it's a bipartisan issue right now. It's really too bad, and I think there have been concerns all the way back to Eisenhower about the military-industrial complex and the ability of the intelligence community to truncate and place off limits public debate about what they do, and I think we saw this play out. Now, we've had exceptions too. Under the Bush administration, there were 4 gigantic national security surveillance programs.
This is Bush 2.
Bush 2. Starting in 2002, there were 4 big national security programs, and 3 of them have now been discontinued. There's 1 left. That's Section 702, but internet metadata, telephone records collection, and massive content collection under purely presidential authority. Those 3 have all ended.
As far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we know, but they're not. They've made sworn statements in public that they've ended. So yes, they could be lying, and I'm not saying that, but they weren't doing that, and now they are.
The famous clip of General Clapper,
right,
in a televised hearing, saying we are not doing things like that.
Yeah.
Edward Snowden has played a particular role in publicizing that bit of.
Yeah, it's what spurred him to act, watching the lying. So there's definitely a concern about lying, but at this point, if that's true, then they've had to stop doing it publicly and start doing it surreptitiously.
Right.
And my point is that on the one hand, it's very frustrating that in this latest battle we were not able to scale back what the government is doing. But they have scaled back. Well, there was a law passed for telephone records collection, but all the other programs have been scaled back because of the public pressure. They just didn't happen in a big congressional showdown situation. Right. Something called about searching, which is when the government is searching through the content of communications that it's collecting off of the telecommunications infrastructure, was stopped voluntarily by the government after pressure from the FISA court, that they were not able to do it.
FISA court being the special court of judges, already sitting federal judges, who have temporary assignments to make judgments when the government seeks warrants to surveil people electronically or...
Correct, in the context of national security.
Right,
so
right.
Originally this court, FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, was aimed at when the government was seeking warrants to track spies.
Right.
Right. So if there was a spy in America and they wanted a warrant to track it, they wasn't going to go to a criminal prosecution. It was part
Right.
of intelligence, and so they would go to this court, which you're correct, is a set of judges who have been specially designated by the Chief Justices
Right.
of the Supreme Court to hear these classified cases. The role of this secret court was dramatically expanded
after 9/11.
After 9/11, and now they kind of serve as an ongoing referee of all national security surveillance, right. Not just surveilling spies, but surveilling anybody overseas when Americans are caught up in the overseas surveillance, whether that's because it's a one-end communication, you're talking to somebody in France and that communication is being surveilled, or whether your communications travel through the same switches as international communications, right. which happens a lot. This is the number we're trying to get from them. How many people are actually caught up either because they talk to people overseas and they get caught by this communication, or because their communications are routed through the same switches, or they're sitting at Google next to, in the databases next to somebody who's overseas, and therefore their communications get rifled through on the way to getting
right.
to what they really want. That's the number that the government has never told us, and I think they've never told us that because Americans would be shocked at how many people are caught up in that.
You think it would be a large percentage of the American population?
Absolutely. I think it would be the majority of Americans. Just the way the internet infrastructure works.
So the recent, relatively recent extension of it's the PRISM program, I believe, that was extended.
There's two. One is called PRISM,
yes.
and the other is called Upstream.
Right.
That are the publicly known programs
right.
that are under 702. I suspect there are others as well.
And so that's, you believe, still a threat to our privacy?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the difference between, the cops having an interest in you and going to your house and getting approval to search your house, and the cops interested in you and therefore getting permission to search every house on your, every house in your town, right? It's the difference. It's not a proportionate search.
Or every house of anyone I know.
Or every house of everybody who lives near you. It's not just you. This is the thing, is that the argument that the government has is as long as they have a foreign target, everybody else who they search on
right.
the way to that doesn't matter. It's really more like there are checkpoints on the internet
right.
all over the place. These are these switching stations. And anybody who drives through that, whose communications drive
right.
through that checkpoint gets that communication searched.
The fundamental issue underneath this is how much of our privacy or our assurance of privacy are we willing to surrender or compromise on in the name of national security?
I think so. I think that there's some pushing that needs to happen there, because I think that the idea that you surrender your privacy and therefore you get more national security is not yet proven.
Not automatic.
No, these things are not connected, right? You can walk around naked and you're not more secure. So I don't think that I think that there's a proposition there that needs to be interrogated. And then, of course, I think most people will want to know how much, right? But, we know that once the government searches through this stuff and then collects it, that the FBI can search through that information for purely domestic crimes.
Right.
So it's not just first of all, so the idea that you're just giving up for national security is not true. You're giving it up for any law enforcement purpose, much broader than just national security. and much broader than national security because it's all foreign intelligence, and foreign intelligence can include things like, whether our companies are getting a fair shake in trade deals from other things. So it's much broader. And then the question about, how much more safe are we getting is one that the government refuses to answer. So, we know that they come up with these stories about how they've stopped so-and-so terrorists because of these programs, but whenever you scratch on it a little bit, you find out it's much murkier than that, and that's why they've stopped people from scratching on it.
And yet, in these times, whether foreign or domestic, there are a lot of people saying, including the president, well, why is the FBI not more capable at finding these people who are complained about to them and stopping them from committing crimes?
Yeah, and I
and
think
the only way to do that is to invade their privacy.
I don't think that that's true at all, and certainly not invade all the rest of our privacy.
No.
I mean, there's a problem here that the match between what they're doing and what they need to do in order to do better, building a bigger haystack doesn't actually help you find the needle, right? It's targeting, so swooping in all the rest of us and forcing the government to go through all the dreck of our daily communications, all of it, in order to get to this thing they wanted is not, I think, fair. I would question whether that's your best strategy. It gets a lot of other things that the government wants, but it doesn't actually, I think, solve the main problem of trying to do better intelligence about the things that you want. This is what the 9/11 Commission found. The 9/11 Commission did not find that the government needed more power in order to stop the terrorists. It found that the government wasn't smartly using the power that it already had.
Right.
And this whole surveillance infrastructure is based upon the idea that the government needed more power to stop these, as opposed to better use of the power that it already has. And I submit that we need to have a real public discussion about this with real facts. Like, what are the, as opposed to teaching more people how to speak those languages that they needed to be able to speak. This is all stuff from the 9/11 Commission. Empowering people who flagged a problem in Minnesota to get the attention of the Justice Department.
Coordination of these vast bureaucracies with each other.
None of that is affected by giving the government the massive infrastructural power to watch everybody's communications as they
So
go
who's
by.
going to lead? It's hard to disagree with your saying this is the kind of public discussion we need. How are we going to get it? Who's going to create it? Who's going to lead it?
Well, I think that
the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
I would be delighted to. I think that rightfully this ought to be the Congressional Intelligence Committees, but there's a lot of research about them that they are pretty captured by the intelligence community. I think if you look at why those committees were set up, they were set up to be a check, and not to be a rubber stamp of what the intelligence community is doing. But I don't think that they have served that purpose very well. And in fact, they're as secretive, if not more so. I mean, other than the kind of, we've had some recent politically driven things about the
very politicized memos and
one-sided and not the other. And I mean, to me, it just demonstrates the dysfunction, right? They're not working on behalf of the American people.
Well, the people have a very hard time understanding those internal disputes about the memos.
Yeah, and I just think that I think in a functioning governmental system, the intelligence committees, back to the church committee, right, which was how we got FISA in the first place, a functioning oversight by Congress.
Church committee in the 1970s.
70s is how we got the kind of limitations.
The first look inside, and there was a committee in the House as well, Otis Pike, if I remember correctly, congressman from New York.
Yeah, and so there has been a time when Congress has served this, but 1970s. I mean,
it's a while ago.
There's a lot of the people involved in this weren't even alive then. So that, in theory, could be a place, but I don't think we've got the Congress right now to do it. I think that I have been trying to get the U.S. courts, the federal open, not secret, the federal open U.S. courts.
Right, not the FISA court.
Not the FISA court. It is, the FISA court has actually ended up, it's 90% rubber stamp, 10% they've done some good stuff, but they have not had the independence. They haven't had the ability to hear from both sides.
But how do you get the courts? You have to bring the right lawsuits. You have to get them before the right judges.
Yep, and we've had a case called Jewell versus NSA for 10 years where we're trying to get this done.
Take the long view.
Oh my! Well, these are hard fights.
Sure.
You know, I mean, again, Eisenhower wasn't kidding when he said you've got to worry about these things. But just last Friday, the government was forced to hand over to our judge in California in secret, but we're going to have that fight in a second, everything about the scope of the government's collection of people's communications. The federal judge said, look, I cannot decide whether these people that the EFF has brought before me were subject to the surveillance or impacted by the surveillance unless you show me what the scope of your surveillance is. And the government fought tooth and nail, years of fighting on this. But finally, the judge said, look, enough. Like, these people deserve.
And so this is not a partisan thing. This is the government, the intelligence community, which is neither red nor blue nor purple.
Correct.
Fighting for a set of prerogatives that it doesn't want to give up.
That's right, and it's really, it's bipartisan on both sides. As I said, there are voices on the Democratic side and on the Republican side of this debate who are nervous about this, and there are voices both sides who are not. And you know, the intelligence community has a lot of jobs in a lot of people's districts and things like that that play into the political discussion, but it really is a question of, you know, do we think that there are wise old men who know better than the rest of us, and not you know, that the spycraft and intelligence is the kind of thing that happens in books where you get, you know, wise men who make these decisions for the rest of us, or do we really want a self-governing country where, you know, of course there are some things that are secret, but that's a small amount compared to the ways that the American people need to decide when your communications and your network of communications, so it's, you know, part of this is the content of your communications, but the much more powerful part is who are all the people you talk to, what do your networks look like? They call this contact chaining or call chaining. When that's readily available to the government,
that is an inhibition on free speech.
Absolutely, and this is the part that I think, you know, kind of comes back to our program here. I think that free speech is such a vital, people talk about this in terms of privacy, and absolutely, I'm on board with it, but I think what gets overlooked sometimes is the free speech component of this, and the right to associate, the right to build communities that can stand together.
To assemble, to present grievances,
association,
to do all those things the First Amendment says.
Yeah, and I think that gets missed in all of this cloak and dagger spy, blah, blah, blah stuff, which is, you know, fun and interesting, but we've all read, you know, the novels about that. But
so we don't need the reality.
It's okay, but it's not, the reality is not the novels, right? The reality is some people with computers who are able to find out everybody who you talk to. And that's fine if you're not interested in changing your government. But it gets really dangerous if you're interested in changing your government, because, you know, they will try to stop that. They're going to try to protect their power. And when we see this, you know, we certainly see this in the United States, where organizers and activists who are trying to over the government become the targets of surveillance. This overwhelmingly affects vulnerable people. Right now in our country, it affects immigrants, it affects people who are doing Black Lives Matter, it affects people who are trying to organize against gun violence. It affects, or for gun protection, honestly, that, you know, there's surveillance of any organization, regardless of the political will, although I think right now in the government we're seeing it slanting one way. This matters if you want to have a functioning democracy, and, you know, it's very real. It's not the stuff of science fiction, it's not the stuff of spy novels. We see this a lot overseas. We work with groups all around the world.
We are more, we can recognize it better overseas.
Well, that may be true. But we certainly have long worked at EFF with people in China who are trying to work on China. They're massively surveilled. We've supported some of the oppression against the Falun Gong, and the building of technologies of oppression by sometimes American companies. We see this in a lot overseas, and the governments absolutely take advantage of the fact that they can go to tech companies and find out who's in the opposition. There's no reason to think that is never going to happen here, and we, you know, isn't happening now here. And again, I think that, you know, I believe that self-government is the right way to go. I don't think that you should have kings, and I don't think that you should have oligarchs or, you know,
Right.
kind of wise old men who decide what's best for the rest of us. But you can't build that unless people have the ability to have a private conversation.
Thank you very much. We've been discussing issues of free speech and privacy in the internet age with Cindy Cohn of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. To learn more about Georgetown University's Free Speech Project, visit our website. Thanks for watching. I'm Sanford Unger.